Hello, and welcome back. Whether you're here with us for the first time tonight, or you've been settling in with these stories for a while now, I'm genuinely glad you're here. I'm Mr. Dantello, and tonight we're exploring stories that live in that strange territory where reality starts to bend in ways that are difficult to explain. These are psychological and mind-bending tales, the kind that burrow into the everyday and twist it into something unsettling. Stories where the world works differently than it should, where time and logic stop following the rules we thought were certain. Tonight, we have 3 stories for you. First, we're visiting a desk where work appears before it's assigned, a place where tomorrow's tasks are somehow already completed. Then we'll meet someone whose internal sense of time has fractured, leaving them out of sync with every clock they encounter. And finally, we're going to explore a grocery store that rearranges itself when no one's paying close attention. If you've found something here that speaks to you, please do consider liking and subscribing. It helps us keep these stories going, and it means everything. Now, get yourself comfortable. Find whatever position feels right. A pillow, a blanket, whatever helps you settle in. Make yourself at home. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from tonight? And what time is it where you are? Now, let's begin with our first story. Story 1. The desk where I keep finding tomorrow's work already done. Hashtag the desk where I keep finding tomorrow's work already done. The fluorescent lights hummed the same way they did at noon, which was to say they hummed the way they always did, a frequency just below conscious thought, but never below the body's knowledge of it. I'd learned to time my breathing with the hum. In through the nose for 4 pulses, hold for 4, out for 4. It helped with the headaches. The office at 4 in the morning looks like something between a museum and a waiting room. All the surfaces catch the overhead light in the same flat, clinical way. The desks are a uniform beige, not quite gray, not quite tan, with a laminate that reflects the fluorescence and streaks. Someone had once told me the color was called linen, which seemed optimistic. Linen was soft. This was the color of a waiting room in an insurance office where no one smiled. My cubicle was in the northwest corner of the 3rd floor, which meant I could see the window well before I reached my desk. The glass was black at this hour. Not the black of night exactly, more like the black of something thick and still. Rain had been threatening since midnight, and the clouds had finally delivered. I could hear it on the windows, that patient, methodical tapping that sounds the same whether you're alone or surrounded by the noise of a working day. I'd gotten in the habit of arriving before 5, before the night security guard finished his rounds, before the building system switched over to what maintenance called day mode, which mostly meant the bathrooms got cleaned and the heating adjusted. My manager didn't know I came in this early. No one did. It was the only real quiet left in the place. Those hours when the desk belonged fully to me and to no one else. I set my coffee on the left corner, the same way I always did. It was from the bodega on the corner, dark roast, black, The cup was warm against my palm even through the cardboard sleeve. I never drank it. The habit was comfort, not caffeine. By the time the office started filling up around 8, the coffee would be a dark skin forming on the surface, and I'd throw it away. This happened every morning. I never quite decided if I was fooling myself or if I genuinely forgot the coffee was there. The monitor flickered on, that initial moment of gray before the computer finished waking. I settled into the chair, the same chair I'd been assigned 4 years ago, its mesh backing worn smooth on the left side where I leaned. The keyboard tray had developed a slight wobble. I kept meaning to report it. I never did. My inbox had 247 messages. This was normal. This was Tuesday morning, technically, though the distinction felt arbitrary. I was 3 days behind on a minor reconciliation report and 2 weeks behind on something I'd categorized as pending clarification, which meant I was avoiding it entirely. Neither was urgent. Nothing here was ever quite urgent. The urgency had been engineered out of it, replaced by steady, manageable dread. I pulled up the reconciliation. The spreadsheet was open on my desktop, quarterly_analysis_03 XLSX, file dated 2 weeks ago. I'd opened it twice, added a few rows of formulas, and then closed it without saving. The work felt pointless in the particular way office work feels pointless at 4 a.m. It felt like moving sand from one side of a bucket to the other while someone watched. I moved the cursor to cell A1 and tried to focus on the line items. The room was so quiet, I could hear the cooling fan inside the desktop tower. A white noise that should have been soothing and somehow wasn't. The rain continued its patient work against the windows. I was reviewing the second quarter data, comparing actual to budgeted, flagging variances over 3%, when I became aware that something was wrong. Not wrong in the sense that an alarm goes off. Wrong in the way you become aware of a smell you've been breathing for hours but only suddenly notice. A wrongness that had perhaps been there all along. The spreadsheet was complete. Not partially complete. Not mostly complete. Complete in the way a finished thing is complete, all the way down to row 487, every cell filled, every formula calculated, every variance flagged in the conditional formatting I myself had set up. The final summary cell showed a neat variance of 1.8%. The work was correct. I could see that immediately. The numbers aligned. The formulas were sound. The whole thing held together with the kind of precision that would take me the better part of a day to produce. But I hadn't done it. I remember very clearly the sensation of not breathing. Not the sensation of my lungs forgetting to breathe, but the sensation of my conscious mind stepping outside of the mechanism and noticing that it was breathing anyway, like watching your hand move without deciding to move it. The cursor was in the last cell. The last cell contained my initials, Ridge, Riley Jameson, and a timestamp. The timestamp said yesterday, 4:47 p.m. I'd been home yesterday at 4:47 p.m. I remembered this with the kind of crystal clarity that only comes when you're trying to prove something to yourself. I'd been sitting on my apartment couch. I'd been watching something on my laptop. There had been a commercial for a kitchen gadget that made spiral vegetables. I'd thought about my mother who liked spiraled vegetables. I'd thought about texting her and then didn't. I'd made tea. The tea had gone cold. I'd thrown it away at 4:51 p.m. I sat back in the chair. The wobble in the keyboard tray was suddenly very pronounced. I'd moved, which meant the whole setup had shifted slightly, and now the wobble was audible when I breathed. Or no, the wobble wasn't audible. The tray was simply loose, and I was noticing it. The distinction felt important in a way I couldn't articulate. I clicked on the file details. It showed last modified and a name. My name. 4:47 p.m. and my name, the same way my name appeared on every email I sent, every document I touched, every piece of work that passed through my hands. The reasonable thing to do would have been to laugh. The reasonable thing would have been to assume I'd blacked out, come to work, done the work, and forgotten about it. This happened to people, didn't it? Lost time. Missing hours. My father had once failed to remember an entire weekend. I'd read that article about the woman who drove for 3 days without knowing how she'd gotten in the car. But I hadn't forgotten. I was very certain I hadn't forgotten. I pulled up my calendar. Tuesday, the week before Thanksgiving, 4:47 p.m. was shown as unscheduled. I wasn't supposed to be at the office. I opened my email and went to Sent Items and looked at the message timestamps from yesterday. There were 4 emails, all sent between 9:00 and 11:30 a.m. I'd been at home all day yesterday. I'd called in sick. The rain sounded heavier now. Or perhaps I was just noticing it more. The coffee sat cooling on the corner of my desk, exactly as it did every morning, as if the day hadn't just bent itself into a shape I didn't recognize. I closed the spreadsheet. I opened it again. The work was still there. The completion was still dated. The initials were still mine. I looked around the cubicle as if I might find something I'd missed. The desk contained what my desk always contained: a stapler. A picture frame with a photo I'd taken of the lake near my apartment, just the water and trees, nothing with people in it. Some pens. A notebook I'd bought 6 months ago with the intention of journaling, and instead used to write down software passwords. A desk calendar, still turned to October. The computer tower, the monitor, the keyboard with its occasional stickiness on the Q key. Nothing that explained anything. The logical thing was to check my phone. I'd kept my phone with me yesterday, I was sure. I knew this the way you know your own hands are attached to your wrists. I pulled it from my jacket pocket and scrolled through my location history. The phone showed my apartment address from 2:15 p.m. on yesterday until 6:42 p.m. Then it showed my apartment address again from 6:42 p.m. onward. No record of travel to the office. No cellular data pings from the building where my desk was located. I sat very still. The chair was uncomfortable in a familiar way. The hum of the fluorescent sounded like white noise through water. There were several possibilities. My phone's location data was wrong. The spreadsheet had been completed by someone with access to my account and my signature and my work files. Or I had been here, actually here, physically present, and my phone had malfunctioned and my memory had somehow glitched. And I'd forgotten an entire afternoon spent completing a quarter's worth of reconciliation work with mechanical precision. None of these felt true. I clicked through the spreadsheet again, slowly, row by row. The work was meticulous. It was careful. It was my work in the sense that it used my methods, my preferred formatting, my habitual way of flagging and noting and organizing. But it wasn't my work in the sense that I hadn't done it. The rain continued. The fluorescent lights continued their patient humming. Somewhere on one of the other floors, the heating system kicked in with a metallic clunk that echoed through the building's empty spaces. I pulled out my notebook and wrote the date at the top of a fresh page. Tuesday, the week before Thanksgiving. Then I wrote, spreadsheet completed. I did not complete it. The timestamp is wrong. My location data is wrong. Neither of these things is possible. I stared at what I'd written. The pen was in my hand, and I was about to underline it, to give the statement some kind of emphasis, when I noticed that the handwriting wasn't quite mine. It was very close. It was close enough that I'd have signed it without thinking. But the letters were slightly too careful, slightly too uniform. The way I write when I'm thinking about how I'm writing, not the way I actually write. I put the pen down. For the next hour, I did nothing but sit at my desk and look at the spreadsheet. I didn't drink the coffee. I didn't check my email. I didn't try to find an explanation. I simply sat and existed in the space between the work I had done and the work I hadn't. At 5:47 a.m., my desk phone rang. The sound was so unexpected, so alien in that early hour, that I didn't reach for it immediately. It rang twice more before I lifted the receiver. The weight of it was familiar. A standard office phone, black plastic, the kind that had been standard issue for 2 decades. Hello? My voice sounded wrong in my ear, too loud, too real. There was no response. Just the sound of the phone line, which wasn't quite a dial tone and wasn't quite silence. It was the sound of a connection with nothing on the other end. I listened for about 5 seconds. Then I hung up. The ringtone had triggered the normal response pathway. You answer, you speak, you listen for response. But something in the quality of that silence had felt intentional. Not the absence of someone trying to reach me, the presence of something confirming that the line worked. I looked at my computer screen. The spreadsheet was still there, still complete, still marked with timestamps and initials that suggested I'd done work I had no memory of doing in a building I had not visited. The rain had started to sound like it might never stop. I reached for the coffee and was surprised to find it wasn't cold. I had no recollection of drinking it, but the level was noticeably lower than when I'd first arrived. The liquid was still warm. I set the cup back down very carefully and did not pick it up again. I stayed at the desk until 6:30 a.m., when the early building staff would begin arriving. I needed to move through the normal world. I needed to see other people. I needed to understand whether everything that had happened was precisely as strange as it felt, or whether my perception had simply fractured and was now playing tricks on me. When I stood up, My legs didn't quite respond the way they should. Not weakness exactly. Just a strange lag between intention and movement, as if my muscles were waking up after sleep I didn't remember having. The hallway outside my office was the usual maze of cubicles and conference rooms. Everything was in its place. Nothing had moved. The fluorescent lights hummed their familiar, vaguely nauseating frequency. I walked toward the break room, my footsteps too loud in the quiet, my heart moving at a pace that didn't match my walking speed. The break room was empty. I made coffee, real coffee, fresh, from the machine that had been broken for 3 weeks, but had apparently been repaired sometime without my knowing. I stood and watched it brew, counting the drips. I was acutely aware of my own breathing, as if I'd suddenly forgotten how to do it unconsciously. I didn't drink the coffee. I left it on the counter and walked back to my desk. By 7:15 a.m., people began to arrive. I could hear them moving through the building, the distant murmur of voices, the sound of bags being set down, chairs being rolled across the floor. The normal sounds of a workday beginning. I sat at my desk and waited, feeling like someone watching a film of a normal day through glass. At 7:43 a.m., my direct supervisor appeared at my office door. Her name is Morgan. She's been my supervisor for 4 years. She has a particular way of knocking that sounds almost polite, which is unusual for an office environment. She knocked that way now. "Morning," she said. "Got a minute?" "Of course," I said. The words came out smoothly. I was performing normalcy well enough. She entered and closed the door behind her. She was carrying a folder, not digital, but an actual physical folder, and her expression held the careful neutrality of someone about to deliver news that wasn't good, but wasn't catastrophic either. "I wanted to check in about the Hendricks account reconciliation," she said, opening the folder. "You sent it through at 4:15 this morning. That's unusually early for you." I didn't respond immediately. I watched her shuffle through the pages. I reviewed it. She continued, "And it looks thorough. Maybe too thorough. You caught some discrepancies we've been missing for 3 quarters. I'm genuinely impressed." She looked up from the folder. "I just wanted to make sure everything was okay. You're not usually working at that hour." "I couldn't sleep," I said. "Thought I'd be productive." "Well, it worked out." She smiled, though there was something tentative in it. "Just don't burn yourself out, okay? We need you rested. Can't have my best analysts exhausted." After she left, I opened my computer and pulled up the Hendricks file. The reconciliation was there, dated 4:15 a.m. The work was meticulous. The discrepancies Morgan had mentioned were flagged clearly, with notes explaining what had been missed and by how much. It was excellent work. Work that I do, but only after careful review and with a methodical approach that usually takes me hours of full concentration. I had no memory of it. I stood up and walked to the bathroom. I locked myself in a stall and sat on the closed toilet lid, hands pressed flat against my thighs. My breathing had become shallow. I was aware of the cold tile wall pressing against my shoulder. I was aware of the sound of the bathroom fan spinning at a rate that seemed slightly too fast. I was aware that I couldn't think clearly about what was happening, because thinking clearly would require accepting that something was happening. When I emerged from the stall, I washed my hands. The water was hotter than I expected. I watched the soap foam disappear down the drain, swirling and thinning until it was gone. In the mirror, I looked like myself. Same face, same tired eyes, same slight asymmetry to my expression that I've never liked. Everything was exactly as it should be. I went back to my desk. The morning moved forward in the normal way. Emails accumulated. Meetings were scheduled. The regular rhythm of work continued. I participated. I answered questions. I took notes during a budget review that had absolutely nothing to do with reconciliations or spreadsheets or work I didn't remember doing. Twice, I caught myself checking my watch to confirm the time, as if I didn't trust what I was seeing. Both times, the time was exactly what it should have been. At lunch, I didn't eat. I sat in my car in the parking garage with the doors locked and the engine off. The garage was dim and cool. A few cars were parked in scattered spots. Everything smelled like concrete and faint gasoline. I tried to reconstruct what I could remember about the early morning. What had I actually experienced, and what had I imagined? The spreadsheet appeared on my screen. That was real. I had seen it. The handwriting on the signature line, that was real. The coffee, I hadn't drunk it consciously, but the level was lower. That was observable, if not entirely explainable. The phone call, that was real. The receiver had been heavy in my hand. The sound had traveled through real speakers. But I had done the Hendricks reconciliation at 4:15 a.m. That was also real. It existed in the system. Morgan had seen it. She had praised it. The only explanation was that I had done it and simply forgotten. A gap in memory. Possible stress-related, perhaps, early morning fugue state. These things happen to people. Not often, maybe, but not impossible. Except I could feel the difference between forgetting something I'd done and having done something without ever doing it at all. I could feel the difference between a gap in memory and an absence of experience. When I returned to my desk at 1:15 p.m., I found a handwritten note next to my computer keyboard. It was written on office memo paper, the standard yellow kind that had been in the supply closet for years. The note read, "Need to talk. 3rd floor conference room. 3 p.m. Come alone." The handwriting was mine again. That careful, slightly too uniform handwriting. The letters slightly too exact. The spacing slightly too considered. I looked around the office. Nobody was paying particular attention to me. The day was proceeding normally. People were at their desks or in meetings or on breaks or having quiet conversations about weekend plans or television shows. Nothing was different from any other day. The building was full of normal people doing normal things. And someone, some version of someone, had left this note where I would find it. I turned the paper over. There was nothing on the back. I put it in my desk drawer and tried to focus on work. At 2:47 p.m., I began to feel anxious. Not the ordinary stress of a workday, but something deeper. An anticipatory anxiety. The feeling of waiting for something important to happen, even though I wasn't sure what it was. At 2:58 p.m., I stood up and walked toward the elevator. The third floor was quieter than my floor. It was where the archived records were kept, and most of the space was taken up by filing systems and old equipment that nobody had bothered to remove. Conference rooms on this floor weren't used much. Meetings happened elsewhere. The fluorescent lights up here were older, and they flickered with a subtle, barely perceptible rhythm. Conference room C was at the end of the hallway. The blinds were already closed. I opened the door. The room was empty. It was completely empty. No people, no furniture, just the bare gray carpet and the white walls and a single window with the blinds shut. There was no table, no chairs, no anything. The space was entirely blank. I stood in the doorway for several long seconds. I didn't enter the room. Something about the threshold felt significant. The idea of crossing it felt consequential. I closed the door and walked back to the elevator. When I returned to my desk, the note was gone from my drawer. I hadn't taken it. I hadn't removed it. It simply wasn't there anymore, as if it had never been placed in my desk at all. The drawer was empty except for the standard office supplies and a few documents that belonged there. I sat down very slowly. The afternoon light was slanting through my office window at a particular angle that meant it was somewhere around 3:30 p.m. The day had continued while I'd been gone. My screen had gone to sleep. My phone showed no new messages. Everything was exactly as it had been. Except that an hour had passed, I had gone to an empty conference room that didn't match any memory I had of the building's layout, and the note had disappeared. I opened my email and began to scroll through messages, trying to focus on something normal, trying to hold on to the idea that this was all manageable, explainable, that there was a logical progression from one moment to the next, and that I simply wasn't seeing it clearly enough yet. At 3:54 p.m., I received an email from Morgan. The subject line was, "Question about your schedule." The body of the email read, "Did you take today off? I don't see you on the afternoon calendar. Everything okay?" I looked at the timestamp. The email had been sent at 3:52 p.m., 2 minutes before I opened it. 2 minutes after I'd returned from the third floor, I typed back, "I'm here, at my desk now." Just stepped away for a moment. Morgan's response came back almost immediately, "Okay, wanted to make sure. You seemed a bit off this morning." I read the response 3 times. Then I stood up and walked to Morgan's office. She was working at her desk, reviewing something on her computer. She looked up when I entered. "Hey," she said. "Everything good?" "You said I seemed off this morning," I said. "Yeah, a little. But it wasn't a bad thing, just, I don't know, distracted maybe. Is something going on?" "No," I said. "Everything's fine. I just wanted to confirm we'd actually talked this morning." Her expression shifted slightly, not toward concern exactly, but toward a kind of careful assessment. "About the Hendricks file?" she said. "Yes, I came by your office around 7:45. You were already at your desk. You remember that specifically?" "I remember being impressed by your work. It stood out." I nodded. I thanked her. I left her office and returned to my desk. That night, I didn't go home. I waited until the building emptied out, until the cleaning crew had made their rounds and left, until the silence was complete. Then I sat at my desk with all the lights off except the desk lamp, and I opened my work calendar. I'd been trying not to look at it. Some part of me had known what I would find. For the past 3 weeks, according to the calendar, I'd been staying late. Not every night, but most nights. Blocks of time after 10 p.m. were marked with meetings that I didn't remember attending, events that had no description and no attendees listed except my own name. The times were recorded in the system. The events existed. But I couldn't access anything beyond the fact of their existence. No notes, no files. No evidence of what had occurred during those blocks of time except that they had been officially blocked off. I had been here, according to all available evidence. I had been here, and I had been working, and I had been doing things that I was very good at doing, and none of it had left any impression on my memory at all. I closed the calendar. Outside my office window, the city was dark. The buildings were mostly empty. It was the kind of night where you could believe that most people had stopped existing, and only a few of us remained, still sitting at our desks, still going through the motions of being alive. I picked up my pen. I opened a fresh document on my computer. I began to type, slowly and deliberately, trying to construct some kind of record of what had happened, trying to create evidence for the person I would be tomorrow, the person who might not remember any of this. By 2:30 a.m., I had written approximately 600 words. They didn't make sense. The narrative was fragmented. The sequence of events didn't flow properly. But it was something. It was proof, at least, that I had been conscious enough to try. I saved the document with a timestamp in the name. I minimized it. Then I noticed that my desk was slightly messier than it had been. Papers were arranged in a slightly different configuration. Nothing obvious, nothing wrong. Just a subtle shift in disorder, as if someone had moved things and then moved them back, but not quite to where they'd been before. I opened my email draft folder, the messages I'd composed but never sent, and found a draft that I didn't remember writing. It was addressed to myself. The timestamp showed it had been composed at 4:22 a.m., which was impossible, because it wasn't 4:22 a.m. yet. The draft read, "Don't try to stop what's happening. It's already decided." I deleted it. Then I sat in the silence of my office and waited for the morning to come, trying very hard not to think about the fact that I couldn't remember writing that draft, and that someone or something that knew how to type with my hands and access my email account had left it there for me to find. Hashtag Part 3, The morning arrived gray and indifferent. I hadn't slept. I'd sat at my desk through the entire night, watching the city lights gradually extinguish themselves, listening to the building settle into deeper silence, and then slowly resurrect itself as dawn approached. By 7 a.m., other people had begun arriving. I heard them in the hallway outside my office, the sound of keys being inserted into locks, the soft thud of doors opening, the mundane chorus of a workplace waking up. I remained at my desk, my hands flat on the surface in front of me, waiting to see if I would recognize what came next. The first email arrived at 7:43 a.m. It was from Morgan, our department director. The subject line read, "Final numbers for Q3 audit, need immediately." I had no memory of being asked for these numbers. I had no recollection of the audit at all. I opened the message and read, "Alex, these should be the corrected figures. You mentioned last night that you'd have them ready first thing. The meeting with the external auditors is at 2 p.m., and they'll want to verify all data sets before we begin. Thanks." I checked my project files. The corrected figures didn't exist. The spreadsheets I found were outdated, marked with revision dates from weeks ago. There was nothing prepared. There was nothing ready. I stood up from my desk and walked to Morgan's office. My hands were shaking slightly, and I pressed them flat against my thighs as I walked, trying to steady them. Morgan looked up from her monitor as I approached. She seemed surprised to see me, which was strange because we worked in the same building, in the same department, and I had apparently spent most of the last 3 weeks working late in the office after everyone else had gone home. "Alex," she said, "you look terrible. Are you feeling all right?" "The Q3 audit," I said. "The numbers you emailed about. I don't have them ready." She frowned. She looked confused. Then she looked concerned. Not concerned about the audit, but concerned about me. It was the same expression I'd seen on the face of the HR woman, that careful, evaluative look that meant she was trying to decide whether I was currently having some kind of problem that needed to be addressed. "Alex, you sent those to me at 11:47 p.m. last night. They're fine." "They're perfect, actually. That's what I was emailing about. I was just confirming that you'd checked them over and that we're ready for the auditors." "Did you forget that conversation?" I felt the floor tilt slightly beneath me. "I don't remember that," I said. "You don't remember talking to me last night? I don't remember sending you anything." Morgan leaned back in her chair. She was quiet for a moment, and in that moment I could see her deciding something. I could see her making an internal calculation about how to respond to an employee who was claiming not to remember work they'd apparently completed. "Why don't you take the day?" she said, very carefully. "Actually, why don't you take a couple of days? You seem like you could use some rest." "No," I said. "I need to understand what's happening. I need to know what I've been doing here at night." You need to go home," Morgan said. She said it gently, but there was an edge of finality to it. The finality of someone who has made a decision and will not be changing it. "Go home, Alex. Get some sleep. We'll sort this out when you're feeling more like yourself." I left her office. I walked back to my desk. I was moving through space that suddenly felt unreliable, as if the walls had shifted slightly in their relationships to one another, as if the geometry of the building itself was slowly being redrawn according to rules I didn't understand. I sat down at my desk and opened my email. I navigated to the sent folder and looked at the message Morgan had received. There it was, an email time-stamped at 11:47 p.m., marked as sent by me containing a comprehensive set of corrected financial data with notes and commentary that showed a depth of analysis I remembered doing, but that I had no memory of actually doing. The email was written in my voice. Every sentence structure, every phrase, every analytical approach was recognizably mine. But it wasn't mine. It was mine, and not mine simultaneously. I began to check my other sent emails. I went back through the previous 3 weeks and looked at what I had apparently been sending all through the late hours of the night, all while my conscious mind was somewhere else, or nowhere at all. There were approximately 40 emails. They were all professionally appropriate. They were all competent. Several of them contained solutions to problems I hadn't known I was supposed to solve. One of them contained an entire project proposal that I'd vaguely remembered our department discussing, but which I had absolutely no recollection of researching or composing. And then I noticed something else. The typos in those emails were different from my usual typos. I have a specific pattern of mistakes. I tend to miss the letter "ah" in longer words, and I'm prone to leaving off endings on compound words. The emails I'd apparently sent contained typos I didn't recognize. Typos that looked almost like someone else's mistakes run through my keyboard. I pulled up my document from the night before, the one I'd typed while trying to document everything that was happening, and I saw, with a clarity that made my throat tighten, that it had been modified since I'd saved it. The modification timestamp was 4:22 a.m., exactly when the draft email had been written. I opened the file. The first section was mine. The fragmented, confused narrative I'd composed while sitting in the dark. But after the first 600 words, the text continued. Dozens of paragraphs written in a voice that was similar to mine, but not quite mine. A perspective that seemed to understand what was happening to me in a way that I didn't. The additional text read like someone describing me from the outside, like someone else's observation of my own internal experience. It described the fear with a kind of distant precision, as if cataloging it rather than feeling it. And it ended with a single sentence. The best workers are the ones who can accomplish their tasks without the interference of consciousness. I closed the document immediately. I closed it so quickly that I nearly knocked over my desk lamp. The light swung forward and back, and I watched the shadow it cast move across my desk, and in that shadow I saw the shape of my hands, which looked somehow wrong, too still, too deliberate, as if they belonged to someone else who was learning how to operate them. I stood up. I grabbed my keys. I didn't think about the fact that I had no memory of how I'd arrived at work that morning, or what route I'd taken, or even when I'd decided to come in. I just knew that I needed to leave, that I needed to be somewhere else, that if I sat at that desk for any longer, I might learn something about myself that I couldn't come back from. I walked toward the elevator. As I waited for it to arrive, I found myself looking at my hands. They were shaking, but not from fear. The shaking looked almost like they were vibrating, as if operating on a frequency that was slightly out of sync with the rest of my body. The elevator doors opened, and I stepped inside. On the elevator's mirrored wall, I saw my reflection. For a moment, just a moment, it seemed like the reflection moved a fraction of a second after I did, like it was catching up with me. And in that mirror I saw something in my own eyes that I didn't recognize. Something patient, something that had been waiting a very long time for me to notice it was there. Hashtag Part 4, the descent, felt longer than it should have. 17 floors, and I counted every one. The numbers lit up above the doors, 17, 16, 15, each one accompanied by a soft chime. And I kept my eyes on those numbers because looking at my hands again would have been worse. Looking at anything reflected would have been worse. When the doors opened on the ground floor, I walked through the lobby without stopping. The security guard, a man named Derek, who'd worked there for 3 years and always nodded at me in the morning, didn't look up from his desk. I don't think he even saw me pass, or perhaps he saw someone pass and simply didn't recognize them. The parking garage was cold, concrete and shadow, and the particular emptiness that large underground spaces contain. My car was where I'd left it, at least I assumed it was where I'd left it, because I had no memory of parking it. And I almost walked past it twice before the key fob in my hand sparked recognition. The interior smelled wrong. It smelled like someone had been sitting in the driver's seat for a very long time, waiting. I drove without knowing where I was going. Took the highway north because the direction felt right, and for the first hour I didn't think about anything except the road and the evening traffic and the way other drivers seemed to avoid getting close to my car. When someone pulled up beside me at a red light and glanced over, they looked away almost immediately, and I realized I was making a face I didn't remember deciding to make. I got a hotel room in a town I didn't recognize, paid cash, used a name that wasn't quite mine but close enough to pass. The woman behind the desk didn't ask questions. She just slid a key across the counter and looked past me while she did it. For 3 days I didn't go to work. I didn't call. I didn't email. I sat in that hotel room and waited for something I couldn't name. While outside the window, the town went about its business and seemed entirely unaware of what I'd carried with me in the form of keys and hands and the particular curve of my own skull. On the 4th day, I opened my laptop. There were no new emails from myself, no documents rewritten in the middle of the night, no messages composed in a voice that sounded almost like mine, but wasn't. Nothing, and this somehow was worse than if there had been. I called the office, spoke to my manager, said I'd had a family emergency, a lie that sat on my tongue with surprising ease, and that I needed to take a week. She sounded relieved. She said they could manage without me. She said there were no urgent projects that couldn't wait. And when I asked her if anyone had been working on a tire proposal, she seemed confused. She said she didn't know what I was talking about. I drove home on a Friday morning. The apartment looked exactly as I'd left it, which is to say, it looked like a place I'd occupied but never truly inhabited. The shower still had water in the pan from before I'd left. The coffee maker still had grounds in the filter. The unmade bed was still unmade, and when I lay down on it, it still held something like the impression of where my body had been. I didn't sleep. I lay there for hours and listened to the building settling around me, listened to the pipes in the walls do their strange hydraulic conversations, listened to the space above the ceiling where the neighbors presumably live their lives in a world parallel to mine. At some point, it became morning again, and I got up because staying still had started to feel like the more dangerous choice. That's when I noticed the voicemail on my phone. I'd had it turned off in the hotel. When I powered it back on, the notification appeared almost immediately. A single message left on the afternoon I'd fled the office. A recording from an unknown number. I played it twice before I realized the voice was my own. It was me, speaking in a tone I didn't remember cultivating, describing the tire proposal in precise detail, describing the metrics, the market analysis, the projected timeline, describing things I had never researched and couldn't possibly have known. The message lasted 4 minutes. At the end, I heard my own voice, my precise voice, my exact inflection say the same sentence I'd read at the bottom of that document. The best workers are the ones who can accomplish their tasks without the interference of consciousness. And then the beep that indicated the message was over. I deleted it. Then I undeleted it. Then I deleted it again. Then I stopped trying and just set the phone down on the kitchen counter and stared at it the way you might stare at something that had just explained something fundamental about itself that you couldn't unhear. Work called on Monday. They needed me back. The tire proposal had apparently been completed and submitted, approved already. They seemed confused about why I'd said I had no memory of working on it. They suggested, very gently, that I might want to talk to someone, a professional. They said they had resources available to employees. They said it was nothing to be ashamed of. I went back on Tuesday. Everything was exactly as I'd left it. My desk, my chair, my keyboard with its familiar constellation of keys worn smooth by use. The only thing different was a small plant that someone had placed beside my monitor, a gesture of concern or perhaps a marker that indicated ownership of the space. I watered it because my hands moved toward the water cooler before my mind had finished deciding whether I should. The work continued. It always continued. New emails appeared, and some of them were addressed to me, and some of them I could remember writing, and some of them I could not. I developed a system. I would write down every email I composed before I sent it. I would photograph the document with my phone so there would be a record of what I had and hadn't done. But the photographs often showed text I didn't remember typing. Or worse, they showed text that matched exactly what had been sent, which meant either I'd written it and forgotten, or something else had written it and made sure that there would be no way to prove it hadn't been me. The line between the two possibilities became very thin. I told myself a story in those early weeks that I was having blackouts, that some part of my consciousness was splitting off and doing this work, and I simply wasn't aware of it. That this was a condition with a name and a treatment, and that I could seek help and be fixed. That there was a difference between something being wrong with my brain and something being wrong with me. But I stopped telling myself that story after about 3 weeks, because the lie had started to feel less like denial and more like a collaboration. The truth, the thing I came to understand during those strange, quiet evenings when I'd sit at my kitchen table and watch the light drain from the sky, was that nothing had happened to me. Nothing had invaded me. No presence had taken residence in my skull. Instead, something had simply revealed itself, some part of me, some function that had always been there, had finally turned itself around and looked at the rest of me directly, had finally stopped pretending to be subordinate. The work I'd been doing was good work, efficient work. I started to take a kind of pride in the things that appeared in my folders each morning, the things I didn't remember doing but which bore the stamp of my labor anyway. And after a while, I stopped trying to photograph them. I stopped trying to document the boundaries between what I knew I'd done and what had apparently been done for me, through me, by me. By late summer, the voicemails stopped coming. The modified documents stopped appearing. The reflection in the elevator mirror started to match my movements again, or rather, I stopped noticing when it didn't. The plant on my desk grew. The apartment stayed exactly as it was, neither cleaner nor dirtier, as if suspended in a state that required no further maintenance. My manager pulled me aside in September and said I seemed better, more focused, she said, more productive. She mentioned a promotion, more responsibility, more compensation, more of the kinds of things that are supposed to matter to people like me. I accepted with gratitude that felt appropriate and real. And here's the thing. Here's the small and lingering thing that refuses to leave. I can no longer remember what it felt like to be the person who was frightened. That terror, that raw animal panic when I realized something was wrong, I can recall the facts of it, the way you might recall facts about someone else's life. But the feeling itself has become distant, like something that happened to a version of me that no longer exists. And I can't tell if that's because time has passed and trauma fades, or if it's because the thing that was doing the work has simply learned to be more thorough, more complete. Some mornings I sit at my desk and I look at my hands resting on the keyboard, and they look familiar but also not. They look like hands that belong to someone who knows exactly what they're supposed to be doing. Someone who has always known. Someone who never needed to consciously decide to move at all. And sometimes, just sometimes, I catch myself mid-movement and I'm not sure if it was me who decided to reach for that file, or if I'm simply discovering after the fact that the decision has already been made. That somewhere in the architecture of my own mind, there's a version of me that's working on tomorrow's projects right now. Working very quietly. Working very well. Working, I think, without my permission. Or perhaps, and this is the thought that sits with me in the evenings when the office is empty and the building is silent, working with a kind of permission that's so deep, so fundamental, that I could never find the part of myself that gave it. The thought arrives each night like clockwork, and each night I let it stay. Story 2. My sleep schedule doesn't match the clock's anymore. Hashtag, my sleep schedule doesn't match the clock's anymore. The bedside clock read 3:47, and when I first noticed, something wasn't right. Not that anything felt catastrophically wrong, just an inconsistency, the kind that nags at the precise part of your brain that has always needed things to align. I'd woken from the kind of sleep that leaves you momentarily disoriented, that suspension between dream and waking where the room feels both familiar and strange. My throat was dry. The apartment was the particular kind of quiet that only exists in the deep hours. The sound of the city muffled beneath layers of walls and distance and night. I'd reach for my phone to check the time, the way you do when you wake in darkness, and it had read 4:12 a.m. 25 minutes. That was the gap between what the clock on my nightstand said and what my phone said. I'd stared at both screens in that dim pre-dawn light, the glow casting everything in shades of blue-white, and felt a small, specific irritation bloom in my chest. One of them was wrong. Probably the bedside clock. It was old. Something I'd inherited from the apartment's previous tenant, along with some dust and the faint smell of someone else's life still lingering in the closet. I'd set my phone's time as the correct one and rolled over, pulling the covers back up to my chin. The mattress was still warm. Outside, the city hummed its low, constant frequency, distant traffic, the hum of something electrical in the walls, the wind against the window frame. By morning, I'd forgotten about it entirely. The apartment was small. 2 rooms and a narrow kitchen that opened into a living space barely large enough to fit a couch and a television. High ceilings that made the square footage feel slightly less claustrophobic than it was. Windows that faced east, so light came in early and aggressive, turning the bedroom a pale gold by 6:30. I'd chosen this place specifically for its simplicity. After spending years in shared houses and collective spaces, I'd wanted something that was only mine. A place where I could control every variable, every routine, every moment. The previous tenant had left clocks everywhere. That was what the landlord had called it, with a kind of smile that suggested he thought it was endearing. They were a clock person, he'd said, handing me the keys. Left all the clocks behind. Didn't want to move them, I guess. You can get rid of them if they bother you. I hadn't gotten rid of them. Instead, I'd made them mine through the simple act of staying. There was the digital clock on the nightstand, another on the microwave, a small battery-operated one on the living room wall, stuck between 2 shelves and slightly tilted. My phone, of course. An old wind-up alarm clock in the kitchen, the kind with bells on top that hadn't rung in years. Its mechanism probably corroded by time and disuse. I worked from home in data analysis, the kind of work that requires attention to detail, pattern recognition, the ability to spot where things don't fit. The clocks had been useful, actually. They'd helped me structure the formless days, Those long stretches that can blur together when you're looking at screens in a room with artificial light. I could glance up from my desk and know exactly what time it was. Multiple confirmations, redundancy, safety in synchronization. The morning after I noticed the discrepancy, I'd adjusted the bedside clock to match my phone. It had taken me about 30 seconds. A simple thing. Push the small button on the back, turn the dial, sync it. And then I'd gone about my day. Coffee in the kitchen, a quick breakfast, then back to my desk by 7 to start the work emails that had accumulated overnight. The market was different in different time zones. There was always something waiting. I didn't think about the clocks again until 3 days later. That was when I noticed the microwave clock was off by 8 minutes. Fast this time, not slow. I was reheating coffee at just after 1 in the afternoon, and I'd glanced at the display out of habit. The way you do when you've organized your awareness around timepieces. 1:08 p.m. on the microwave. But when I checked my phone, it was 1 p.m. exactly. The digital display on the microwave was a different model than the others. Older, I'd never paid much attention to it, to be honest. It had simply been part of the kitchen when I arrived. A plastic cube with degraded buttons and a slight smell of electrical burn. The landlord hadn't mentioned it specifically, but it had been grouped in with everything else. The appliances that came with the space. The infrastructure of someone else's life that I'd inherited. I'd adjusted it. Push the right button sequence, I'd had to look it up on my phone, finding the manual PDF in a moment of mild frustration, and set it to the correct time. It had taken me 9 minutes. The whole process had felt like a small failure of efficiency. By that evening it was off again, not by 8 minutes this time, by 5. But in the opposite direction, 5 minutes slow. When I checked at 8:47 p.m. according to my phone, the microwave read 8:42 p.m., and I stood there in the kitchen light, feeling a flutter of something beneath my ribs that I couldn't quite name. Annoyance, probably. The kind you feel when something isn't working the way it should. I adjusted it again. The wall clock was next. That one started running fast, then slow, then fast again. I found myself checking it obsessively. The way you might check a person's vital signs if you were worried about them. By the end of the week, I'd stopped trying to keep it synchronized. I'd simply stopped looking at it. Let it tell whatever time it wanted to tell in the dim space between the bookshelves. The alarm clock in the kitchen had, at some point, been set to a time that was completely divorced from reality. I discovered this on a Tuesday morning when I'd wandered in to make breakfast and glanced at it automatically. It read 11:34 p.m. At that moment, my phone said 9:23 a.m. 2 hours and 11 minutes off. A gap so large it felt almost intentional, like the clock had simply decided to exist in a different temporal space and wasn't going to apologize for it. I didn't adjust that one. I'd simply left it. By then, the irritation had transformed into something else. Not quite concern. A low-level awareness that something in my space was not functioning according to the established order of things. The clocks had become independent actors in my apartment, each one keeping its own time, telling its own story about what the moment actually was. I tried replacing batteries. I tried adjusting them all simultaneously, setting my phone as the universal standard and moving from clock to clock with methodical precision, making sure each one matched exactly. I'd been careful about it. Deliberate, the kind of careful you use when you're trying to solve a problem that you don't quite understand yet. It had taken me an hour and a half, and by the time I was finished, I'd felt almost calm. Here was a problem with a clear solution. Here was something I could fix. Within 4 hours, they were desynchronized again. I discovered this by accident, not by checking. I'd been working deep in a spreadsheet, and I'd glanced up at the wall clock to see if it was nearly time for lunch. It read 12:17 p.m. When I checked my phone to confirm a habit I couldn't seem to break, this constant need for verification, it said 12:03 p.m., not close enough to be a lag in my perception. 14 minutes. The bedroom clock, when I went back to check it, read 12:09 p.m. The microwave read 12:25 p.m. The old alarm clock in the kitchen read 11:51 p.m. Each one was its own moment, its own version of now. I'd sat down at my kitchen table and stared at all 4 clocks visible from that single vantage point. The fluorescent light above the microwave buzzed with that particular electronic sound that you only notice when everything else is quiet. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, the city continued on in whatever time it existed in. I was living in a space where the present moment was not a singular thing. That was when something shifted in me. A small recalibration of perception. Not panic. I wasn't panicked. I was, if I'm being honest, intellectually fascinated. Here was a problem that didn't have a solution, not an obvious one anyway. Here was entropy manifesting not as decay, but as disagreement. I'd gotten up from the table and walked to my bedroom, back to my desk, and tried to work. But I couldn't focus. Every few minutes my eye would drift to the bedside clock, watching the seconds tick forward. Watching it do its job, the red digits bright against the dark screen, counting out moments that my phone was not counting out. By evening, I disconnected the wall clock entirely, removed it from between the shelves, left it on the kitchen counter face down. It seemed kinder than keeping it where I'd have to look at it. The sleep started to fracture on the 4th day. I'd always been someone with a good relationship to rest, a consistent sleeper. I'd go to bed around 11, sleep until 7, sometimes a bit earlier. The structure had been part of the appeal of living alone, of having an apartment I could control completely. There were no roommates with different schedules, no partner who slept later or less. I could enforce consistency. But consistency requires synchronization. I'd gone to bed on the 4th night, following what my phone told me was my regular schedule. 10:47 p.m. according to my phone, which was the time I'd chosen to be my bedtime marker. I'd lain down, followed my routine, breathing exercises, the absence of screens for 10 minutes, the familiar weight of the duvet. The bedroom was cool and dark. Everything was as it always was. I'd woken at what felt like the middle of the night, disoriented and completely alert, the way you wake when your body tells you something is wrong. The bedside clock read 2:34 a.m. My phone read 3:56 a.m. An hour and 22 minutes of disagreement. I'd lain there in the dark, staring at both screens, trying to calculate which one could be right, or if the question of which one was right even mattered anymore. I'd fallen back asleep. Woke again at what felt like moments later. The bedside clock read 4:11 a.m. My phone read 3:47 a.m. Now, the phone was behind. I'd spent the rest of the night in that state of semi-wakefulness, checking repeatedly, watching the gap between times grow and shrink and shift. By the time pale light started coming through the windows, I couldn't remember which clock was which or what any of them had said. I'd simply felt tired in a way that didn't match the concept of morning. It was during the second night of fractured sleep that I made a decision. I'd removed the bedside clock and placed it on top of the refrigerator, out of sight and out of reach. A clock I wouldn't see when I woke in the dark. A clock I wouldn't have to reconcile with my phone. But I still had the phone. The phone seemed important. The phone was the thing everyone carried. The phone was synchronized with cell towers and network time, was updated automatically, was the official version of now in a way that a personal timepiece could never be. The phone was right. Except something in me, some part of my perception that didn't need science or verification, had started to doubt that too. On the third night of interrupted sleep, I'd stopped looking at my phone to check the time. It felt like the only rational move. If I stopped looking, I could stop knowing about the discrepancy. I could stop feeling the small, persistent vertigo that came from being awake at 3 a.m. and not knowing if it was actually 3 a.m. or 2:15 or 4:42, or some time that didn't correspond to anything anyone else in the world was experiencing. My body knew when it was tired. That would be enough. Without the constant checking, the days began to blur together in a way that was almost peaceful. I'd wake when I was rested or when I wasn't. I'd work from my desk, following the rhythm of email responses and the slow accumulation of messages that needed replies. I'd eaten when I was hungry. The apartment existed around me in a kind of temporal fog, and I'd stopped trying to navigate it with the tools I'd been given. The clocks, abandoned and unsynchronized, continued their separate existence. The microwave still ran time when it was on. The old alarm clock in the kitchen sat on the counter, its bell-topped mechanism frozen at 11:51 p.m. forever, or until someone cared enough to try to start it again. I didn't care. I'd let the structure dissolve. It was almost 6 days into this new way of being that something happened that pulled me, briefly, back into the question of time. Back into the question of what was real and what was only my perception of it. I'd been asleep, or resting at least. The apartment was dark. I'd woken with that sudden clarity you get sometimes, the feeling that you've slept enough, that whatever your body needed from unconsciousness had been delivered. I'd gotten up, used the bathroom, walked into the kitchen with the vague intention of making tea. When I'd opened the apartment door to check if there were any packages, a habit, a leftover from my more structured self, I'd found the outside world wet, not just damp. Soaked, The concrete landing outside my door was dark and slick with water. The rain was still falling, not heavily, but steady, the kind of rain that had been coming for hours or maybe all night. Water dripped from the metal railing, ran down the stairs in small rivulets. The entire complex looked like it had been submerged in weather. I'd stepped back inside, closed the door, and made my tea. But the image had stayed with me. The wetness, the continuous present tense of that rain, the absolute certainty of it against my skin for the 3 seconds I'd stood in it. It had seemed real in a way that nothing else had seemed real for days. I'd gone back to bed with the cup in my hands and waited for morning, or something like it. When I finally worked up the nerve to check with a neighbor, it was strange how certain I was that something was wrong. Not with my apartment, with the world, or my place in it. Casey lived in the unit next door. I didn't know them well. We'd exchanged the kind of pleasantries that apartment neighbors exchange, nods in the hallway, a brief conversation about the change in seasons, but not the kind of relationship where you knock on someone's door without thinking about it. I'd thought about it for a long time before I knocked. They'd open the door with the kind of caution that people use when they're not expecting company, and I'd ask the question in the most casual voice I could manufacture. "Has it been raining a lot lately?" Casey had looked at me with something that might have been concern. "Raining? No, not for like a week." "Why?" "Just curious," I'd said. "Thought I heard it last night." They'd accepted this with a nod, the kind of response you give to something that doesn't quite make sense but isn't worth pressing on. We'd parted ways. I'd walked back to my apartment and stood in the kitchen trying to reconcile the wet world I'd felt against my skin with the information that no rain had fallen in days. There was no resolution to that math. By the 7th day, I'd removed all the clocks from visible spaces. The microwave still had its display, but I'd stopped looking at it. The old alarm clock sat in a drawer in the bedroom. The wall clock remained face down on the kitchen counter, like a photograph I couldn't bring myself to throw away but didn't want to see. My phone sat on the table, face up, but I'd stopped checking the time on it. I'd let the screen go dim. I'd silenced the notifications that tried to pull me back into a structured world. I existed now in a kind of perpetual present, one that didn't have a number attached to it. And this was where the strangest part began. Because even without looking at clocks, even without the external markers of time, I could remember them. Specific moments, specific numbers. The bedside clock at 3:47 a.m., the microwave at 1:08 p.m., the wall clock's position at various moments throughout the days. I could recall those times with perfect clarity. But they didn't correspond to anything anymore. They were times that existed only in my memory, associated with moments in my experience, but disconnected from any external reality. Times that no one else would recognize or validate. Times that belonged only to me and the apartment and the slow collapse of the distance between my internal clock and the universe's. I'd sit at my kitchen table, all the visible clocks gone, and I could recite the times they'd shown me, as if I'd internalized them. as if they were encoded into my nervous system now, a map of moments that had nothing to do with the actual progression of the world around me. And I couldn't decide if that meant the clocks had been wrong or if I was. I couldn't decide if I'd ever know the difference. On the 8th day, I noticed the shadows were wrong. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't the kind of thing that would make sense to describe to someone else. But I saw it clearly enough. The light coming through the kitchen window fell across the counter at an angle that didn't match the position of the sun outside. The sun was high and slightly west. I could see that through the glass. But the shadow of the window frame fell as if the light were coming from the north, sharp, perpendicular, belonging to a time of day that didn't exist right now. I stood there for a long time, watching it, waiting for it to shift, waiting for the world to correct itself. It didn't. By evening, the shadow had moved, but not in the way shadows move. It hadn't traveled gradually across the counter. Instead, it had simply occupied a different position, as if someone had erased the old one and drawn a new one in its place. The transition was seamless in my memory. I'd been looking at other things, and when I looked back, it was different. But there was no moment where I'd caught it in motion. I told myself this was normal. Shadows move. You don't always watch them move. You look away, and when you look back, they're somewhere else. This was a function of attention, not of anything being wrong with the world. But the wrongness had a texture now. It had weight. On the 9th day, the apartment began to feel larger on the inside than it should have been. This was harder to articulate, even to myself. The rooms were the same size they'd always been. I knew that in the abstract, the way you know facts about places you've lived for years. Bedroom, living room, kitchen, bathroom, the small hallway connecting them. A one-bedroom apartment in a building that was probably designed sometime in the 1970s with all the modest dimensions that implied. But when I walked from the kitchen to the bedroom, the hallway felt longer. Not monumentally longer, not impossible. Just extended, as if an extra 10 feet had been inserted somewhere between the two doorways. The wall on my left passed in a rhythm that didn't quite match the rhythm of my footsteps. I'd count the steps to the bedroom door, usually 4 or 5 quick strides, and I'd find myself taking 6 or 7, or 8. After the first time I noticed it, I tried to measure it. I used my phone as a measuring device, laying it end to end along the hallway floor. The math came out to what it should be, about 12 feet. My stride length was roughly 2 feet. 6 strides, 12 feet. It all made sense. But it felt longer when I walked it. I stopped trying to measure. Measurement wasn't going to help me. Measurement belonged to the world of clocks and numbers and external validation. That wasn't my world anymore. On the 11th day, I found a coffee cup in the refrigerator. It was sitting on the middle shelf next to the milk, exactly where someone might put it if they'd prepared a cup of coffee and then absent-mindedly opened the wrong appliance. The coffee inside was cold but not solid. The surface still held a faint shimmer of liquid that hadn't yet coalesced into ice. I didn't remember putting it there. More than that, I didn't remember making coffee. I hadn't made coffee in weeks. The coffee maker sat on the counter, dusty, unused. The grounds canister in the cabinet was nearly full, untouched. I'd been drinking water. Tap water. Sometimes so much of it that my stomach felt heavy and sloshing. I stood in front of the refrigerator looking at the cup. The ceramic was cream-colored, ordinary. One of 6 that came with the apartment's move-in package. It had been inside this refrigerator, getting colder and colder in a time when I wasn't aware of it. Someone had put it there. Or some version of me, a version that existed on a different track in a different clock time, had made that cup of coffee and placed it in the cold. I closed the refrigerator without touching it. The cup was still there the next day, and the day after that. I stopped looking at it. By the 13th day, I'd stopped eating in any structured way. Hunger didn't follow a pattern I recognized anymore. I'd feel it at strange moments, acute and specific, demanding immediate attention, then absent again for long stretches. I'd open the refrigerator to find the coffee cup still waiting, and I'd grab whatever was closest, bread, cheese, the contents of a can, and eat it standing up, usually without tasting it properly. The apartment had become a landscape I moved through rather than a space I inhabited. I slept when my body demanded sleep, and it was never for a predictable amount of time. Sometimes I'd wake after what felt like 4 hours and find that I couldn't fall back asleep. Sometimes I'd close my eyes and open them to find that the quality of light had shifted so dramatically that I'd clearly been asleep for much longer than it felt. The sun was my only remaining reference point, and even that was becoming unstable. On the 15th day, I noticed the sun was in the wrong place on the western horizon. Just slightly. Just enough that if you were paying close attention, and I was paying close attention, obsessively close attention, you could see that it was setting a few degrees north of where it should have been for this time of year. Or south. I couldn't quite remember which direction was correct. But one of those directions was definitely wrong, and the sun had chosen it. I stood at the window for hours, watching it complete its arc, waiting for it to correct itself, waiting for the universe to acknowledge that something had drifted out of alignment. It didn't. I had a memory then, sudden and crystalline, of standing in my kitchen months ago, watching rain fall on a dry world. The rain had felt real against my skin, but I'd checked, and no one else had felt it. No one else had seen it. And slowly, over days, I'd come to accept that either I'd imagined it, or my senses were working on a different frequency than everyone else's. Now, I was wondering if my senses had always been on a different frequency. If the world I was perceiving, with its lengthening hallways and shifted shadows and misaligned suns, was actually the world as it had always been, and I was only now learning to see it properly. On the 16th day, I found a note on my kitchen table. I don't know how long it had been there. It could have been days. It could have appeared overnight. I simply hadn't noticed it until I sat down to eat, and my hand brushed against the paper. The note was handwritten in a script that looked almost like my own handwriting, but not quite. The letters were too neat, too deliberate. A forgery made by someone who'd studied the original for a very long time. It said, "You're running out of time." Below that, there was a number, 347. I stared at the note for a long time. I'd seen that number before. I'd seen it many times. It was burned into my memory from when I used to look at clocks, the time that appeared over and over in my recollection, though I could never remember what I'd been doing when I saw it. There was no explanation for how this note had appeared. There was no explanation for why someone would write that particular number at the bottom of a message I didn't remember receiving. I picked the note up carefully, as if it might be fragile, and I placed it face down on the counter, next to where the wall clock had been resting, untouched, for more than a week. And then I did something I hadn't done in days. I went to my phone. I turned on the screen, and I looked at the time. It was 3:47. The realization didn't arrive as a shock. It arrived as a kind of recognition, the feeling you get when you remember something you'd forgotten. Of course it was 3:47. Of course it had always been 3:47. How could I have forgotten something so fundamental? I set the phone down again. But I didn't turn off the screen this time. I sat at the kitchen table, watching the time display, and I waited to see if it would change. It didn't. The minutes didn't progress. The seconds didn't tick forward. The time remained locked at 3:47, and the phone screen cast a pale glow across my face, a glow that didn't seem to match the light coming through the windows. I thought about the note. I thought about the coffee cup in the refrigerator. I thought about the shadows in the hallway and the sun in the wrong part of the sky. And I thought about the rain that had felt real, the rain that no one else had felt, the rain that existed only in my memory and in the space between what I knew should be true and what I'd experienced. I understood in that moment that something had come loose in the world I occupied, or something had come loose in me. I couldn't decide which would be worse, if it was the world or if it was me. But either way, it was becoming clear that the distance between those two things was narrowing. The phone screen still glowed. The time still read 3:47, and the coffee cup in the refrigerator was getting colder and colder, as if it were waiting for someone to drink it, as if it were waiting for me to drink it. I didn't move. I sat at the kitchen table watching the unchanging time, and I listened to the apartment shift around me. Settle sounds. The sounds of a space reorganizing itself when no one was looking. Hallways lengthening. Walls settling. Shadows reorienting themselves to a light source that didn't exist in any normal sky. And somewhere in the thickness of that silence, I felt the question I'd been avoiding begin to form. How long had I actually been here? I got up from the table, and the movement felt wrong. Not because I was injured or sick, nothing so simple as that, but because the distance from the chair to the standing position seemed to take longer than it should have. My legs unfolded slowly, as if time itself had become viscous around my body. The phone screen still glowed. 3:47. I walked to the refrigerator without deciding to. My hand reached for the handle before I'd consciously chosen to move. This was happening more often now, the gap between intention and action collapsing, the two becoming indistinguishable. I would find myself in a different room and have no memory of the hallway that should have connected them. Or I would arrive at my destination to discover I'd been standing there for an amount of time I couldn't account for. The refrigerator door opened to that familiar cold breath, and there it was, the coffee cup, waiting on the shelf where it shouldn't exist, where it had no business existing, where it had been waiting for a duration I could no longer calculate. The cup was ceramic, white. The residue at the bottom had darkened to the color of old wood. I lifted it carefully, and the weight felt normal. Ordinary, the kind of weight a cup of cold coffee should have. That was somehow worse than if it had felt wrong. I raised it to my face, and the smell reached me before I could examine it closely. It smelled like the coffee I'd made, like the apartment, like time that had been waiting in the dark. And underneath all that, there was something else, something like the smell of the rain I hadn't felt, something like the smell of a place I couldn't remember visiting. I set the cup down on the counter very carefully, as if sudden movement might shatter something. Not the cup, something else. Something about the consistency of the air. My breath fogged the kitchen window. I hadn't realized how cold the apartment had become. Not the clean cold of air conditioning, but something older. Something that came from within the walls themselves. I looked out at the street below. The cars were in different positions than they'd been before. I was certain of this, though I couldn't remember the exact configuration from earlier. But looking at them now, I knew they were wrong. They occupied spaces that didn't align with where I'd seen them last. There was a gap in the row, a space where a vehicle should have been, or shouldn't have been. I couldn't decide which disturbed me more. A figure was standing on the corner, completely still. I couldn't see their face, they were too far away, just a silhouette against the gray afternoon that felt too uniform, too unchanging. They weren't moving. They weren't doing anything. They were simply standing there, facing my building, facing my window, facing me. I stepped back from the glass. The figure didn't move, but I felt certain, with a certainty that bypassed all rational thought, that they had registered my movement, that they knew I'd seen them, that they had been waiting for that moment. I went to my phone on the table. 3:47 still. I opened the call log. The last incoming call was from a number I didn't recognize. The timestamp said it was from 3 hours ago, but that wasn't possible. I'd been awake the entire time I was certain I had, wasn't I? Below the recent call, there were dozens of others from the same number, all of them at 3:47. The times were identical, repeated, as if they'd all occurred at the exact same moment, recorded across different days that I couldn't remember living through. I scrolled further back. The records went deep, deeper than they should. My phone should have only stored a certain amount of call history, but these calls went back and back and back, a shaft of identical times descending into digital darkness. All of them at 3:47. All of them from the same unknown number. I tried to call it back. My thumb moved toward the button without my conscious permission. My phone rang before I could press it. The vibration started in my hand, sudden and violent. The sound was wrong, not the normal ringtone I'd set years ago, but something that seemed to come from inside the device itself, as if the phone were calling from within its own architecture. I watched the screen as my own number appeared on the display. I was calling myself, or being called by myself, or the distinction between the two had finally collapsed entirely. I answered. The silence on the other end was complete. Not an absence of sound, but a presence of something that consumed sound. I could hear the quality of it, the particular way it occupied space, and underneath that, I could almost hear breathing that wasn't mine, and a sound like wind moving through somewhere closed. "When do you think you're going to wake up?" a voice asked. It sounded exactly like my own, but aged somehow, worn, like a recording of myself from a time I'd never lived through. "I'm awake," I said. My voice felt unfamiliar in my own mouth. "No," the voice said, "you're not. You stopped being awake at 3:47. Everything since then has been the architecture of that moment, the shape of it extending in all directions. That's not true. I'm here. I'm real. I can feel the cold, can you?" The voice interrupted. "Or are you remembering what cold should feel like? Are you experiencing it, or are you reconstructing it from a template? You've been asking yourself that question for how long now? Since you found the note? Before that?" The window behind me felt suddenly aware of itself. I could feel the figure on the corner through the glass, as if my skin had become transparent. "What do you want?" I asked. "I want to know if you can remember what happened right before 3:47, the voice said. "I want to know if you can still access that moment, because I can't. From where I am, that's the boundary. Everything before is sealed, and everything after is a spiral." The line went silent, not disconnected, still active, still present, but holding its breath. "There's someone at the door," the voice said quietly. I hadn't heard any knock, but looking toward my apartment entrance, I realized the silence around the door had changed. Something was definitely there, waiting. The ambient quiet that had surrounded it for days had shifted, compressed, become intentional. "Don't answer it," the voice said. "Whatever you do, don't answer the door. Because if you do, you'll know that I'm right, and you're not ready to know that yet." The knocking started. 3 measured raps, patient and deliberate. The sound didn't propagate outward into the apartment the way sound should. It stayed localized at the door, as if it were being conducted through a medium only the entrance could receive. "It's not going to stop," the voice continued. "It's going to keep knocking until you answer. Or until you remember that you already have. Many times, too many times to count, the phone went dead. I stood at the kitchen table, the device still pressed to my ear, listening to nothing. The knocking continued. 3 raps, a pause, 3 raps again, mechanical, patient, as if it had learned that persistence was more effective than urgency. I looked at the clock on my phone, still 3:47, and I understood, with a completeness that left no room for doubt or denial, that I had been standing in this kitchen before. many times before, that I had received this call before, that I had heard that knocking before, and that what I did next would determine whether tomorrow existed, or whether tomorrow was simply another iteration of the same moment, stretched thinner and thinner until it became transparent. The coffee cup on the counter caught the light from the window, dark and patient. The figure on the corner was still there, still watching, still absolutely still, and the knocking never stopped. Hashtag Part 4. Aftermath. I don't remember opening the door. That's the thing that sits with me now, weeks later as I write this down. Trying to make sense of it by giving it shape, by forcing it into words that other people might understand. I don't remember the moment of decision. I don't remember my hand reaching for the knob, or the sound of the lock disengaging, or what came after. There's a gap there, clean and absolute, like someone has taken scissors to the film of my life and removed a single frame. When I came back to myself, and I use that phrase deliberately because it felt like returning, like surfacing through water I didn't know I was drowning in, I was sitting on my kitchen floor. My back was against the refrigerator. The apartment was silent. The clock on the microwave read 4:23 a.m. Time had moved. 12 minutes and 16 seconds. An eternity. Nothing. I don't know what I expected to feel. Relief, I suppose. The kind of thing you're supposed to feel when the impossible resolves itself into the ordinary. When the knocking stops and the voice goes silent and the figure on the corner finally moves on to whatever street, whatever building, whatever person it was meant to find next. But what I felt was something closer to hollowness, like I'd been running toward a door I thought was locked, only to discover it was open the whole time, and all that effort, all that resistance, it had been pointless. The answer had always been available. I just hadn't wanted to walk through it. The next morning, I called in sick to work. I couldn't articulate why. The events of the night before, if they had been events at all, didn't have the shape of something you could explain over a phone to a person in HR who didn't know you, who had no framework for understanding that time had done something wrong inside your apartment, that the boundaries of a single moment had expanded to contain multitudes of versions of yourself, all standing in the same kitchen, all at the same impasse. I showered. I changed clothes. I tried to eat something, but the texture of the bread felt like it was remembering how to be bread, going through the motions of nourishment without any actual substance behind it. I threw it away halfway through. By afternoon, everything looked normal again. The apartment was just an apartment. The corner outside my window was just a corner. No one was standing there. The silence was the kind of silence that belongs to a Wednesday, unremarkable and complete. I turned on my laptop. I checked my email. I did the small, necessary things that people do when they're pretending that the world hasn't cracked open and shown them something they can't unsee. But here's what I noticed. In the days that followed, the clocks had all kept their time differently than they used to. It's subtle. Most people wouldn't notice. But I notice. My phone's clock runs about 40 seconds faster than the microwave. The clock in my bedroom lags behind both of them by nearly a minute. When I check my watch against the time on my computer, there's a difference. Sometimes it's my watch that's ahead, sometimes the computer. It changes. It's not consistent. It's as if, after whatever happened that night, the measurement of time in my apartment became something personal, something individual to each device, each corner, each wall. I bought a new alarm clock. It didn't help. The thing that made me understand that something fundamental had shifted wasn't the clocks, though. It was the coffee cup. The morning after the night with the voice and the knocking, I opened my cabinet to get a mug for coffee. And there it was. The same cup that had caught the light while I stood at the kitchen table. But I hadn't remembered putting it away. I had this distinct, clear memory of it sitting on the counter, dark and patient, still holding whatever cold remnants of coffee had been poured into it hours or years earlier. I reached for a different cup instead. I didn't want to touch the one I remembered. But the next morning, it was in my hand before I'd fully woken up. Muscle memory, maybe? Habit, the kind of thing your body does without asking permission from your mind. And when I looked at it, really looked at it, I realized I wasn't sure if it was the same cup or a different one. They looked identical. They might have always been identical. I might have owned dozens of this exact mug and simply never registered the duplication. I decided not to worry about it. Worrying wouldn't change anything. The cup would still be there. The clocks would still disagree. And the moment at 3:47 would still exist somewhere in the architecture of my days. Folded in on itself, waiting, I went back to work after 3 days. My supervisor asked if everything was okay. I told her I'd had a migraine. It was the kind of lie that fits into the space where truth gets too complicated, where explaining that your relationship with time had become unreliable would require them to understand something I didn't fully understand myself. She accepted it without question. People generally do when you give them an acceptable framework for your absence. The routine returned. Wake up, check the time on 3 different devices, and feel a small, familiar vertigo as they all disagreed. Shower. Make coffee in the cup I don't remember choosing. Get dressed. Leave the apartment. Go through the day in the normal way, speaking to people, responding to emails, existing in the spaces that everyone else seemed to agree on. But in the evenings when I came home, I would pause at the moment around 3:45. Not 3:47. I'd learned that the specific numbers didn't matter, that the voice on the phone had been precise about the boundary, but not about why the boundary existed at that particular moment. But that window, those few minutes before the evening shifted into night, something would happen inside my chest. A tightness, a recognition, as if some part of me that was still living in that gap between 3:47 and 4:23 was trying to signal to the rest of me that it was still there, still waiting, still caught in the architecture of that moment extending in all directions. I sleep differently now. I used to fall asleep and wake up, clean transitions from one state to another. Now there's something in between, a place that isn't quite sleep but isn't quite waking either, A space where I can feel the edges of my own consciousness, where I'm aware of myself thinking about being asleep, and that awareness creates a kind of feedback loop that I can never quite escape. My sleep schedule doesn't match the clocks anymore. That's what I've started telling people when they ask why I look tired. It's not inaccurate. It's actually more precise than I have the language to explain. And the voice, I haven't heard it since that night. But I don't think it's gone. I think it's just learned to be silent in a way that's more effective than speech. I hear it sometimes in the spaces between my own thoughts, in the moment before I fall asleep, in the instant when I'm certain I've forgotten something but can't remember what. It's the voice of my own mind, I think, or something wearing my mind like a mask, testing how well the fit has become after all this time. The coffee cup sits on my counter in the morning, waiting to be filled. The clocks keep their individual times. The corner outside my window stays empty except on nights when I'm not paying close attention, when my eyes slide past it without registering the stillness, and then I second guess whether anything was ever standing there at all. And at 3:47, or near enough that the difference has become meaningless, I pause in whatever I'm doing, walking home, preparing dinner, lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, and I feel it. That sense of a moment extending in all directions, a boundary that I crossed and can never cross back through. Everything before that time is sealed, and everything after is a spiral deeper and deeper, more transparent with each rotation. But I don't answer the phone anymore when it rings, because I've realized something that the voice tried to tell me. I've already answered it. I've always been answering it. And the knocking at the door, I hear it sometimes when there's no one there at all. Just 3 measured raps, patient and deliberate. A reminder, a rhythm that has its own life now, independent of anything external, playing out in the quiet rooms of my apartment while the clocks measure time in different directions, and I sit in my kitchen, holding a cup of cold coffee, listening to the boundaries of the moment extend further into the unreasonable dark. Story 3. The grocery store layout that changes when I'm not looking. Hashtag the grocery store layout that changes when I'm not looking. Part 1. The fluorescent hum had become a kind of white noise by year 5 at Brennan's Market. A low, constant thrum that existed just beneath hearing, the way you stop noticing the sound of your own breathing. I'd worked inventory shifts long enough that I could navigate the aisles with my eyes half closed, muscle memory carrying my hands to the right shelf heights, my feet finding the intersections without consultation from my brain. Tonight was Thursday. 2:17 am according to the clock above the service desk, which was wrong by about 4 minutes, same as always. The store wouldn't open for 6 hours. The place was mine in a way that felt almost proprietorial on these nights. The aisles stretched out in their perfect grid, the rows of products aligned like soldiers, everything exactly where inventory said it should be. I'd started in the back, near the stockroom, hauling pallets of cereal boxes forward. Bran flakes, corn puffs, chocolate clusters, granola, the usual Thursday morning delivery. My arms knew the weight distribution, knew how to stack them 3 high without the bottom boxes compressing. I was good at this work, not in any way that mattered to anyone else, but I was methodical. I paid attention to detail. The cereal aisle was aisle 7, running north-south along the eastern perimeter of the store. I'd walked it maybe 2,000 times. The fluorescent panels above cast everything in a color that didn't exist anywhere in nature. A kind of sickly white that somehow managed to drain all warmth from the cardboard boxes, making everything look equally urgent and equally unimportant at once. I was stocking the middle shelf when I first became aware of something being off. Not wrong, exactly off. It wasn't sudden. It was more like noticing mid-task that you'd been humming a song you didn't remember starting. The feeling comes backward. First, you become aware that something is strange, and then you try to locate where it started. By that point, it's already infected several minutes of your life without your permission. What I'd noticed was this. The aisle felt longer than I remembered. Not dramatically longer. Not the kind of thing you'd measure with a tape and find 2 feet of discrepancy. It was more architectural than that. More optical. The way the shelf line seemed to extend toward the back wall of the store, it seemed to take longer for my eye to travel down it. The perspective felt stretched, like someone had very slightly warped the vanishing point. I stood there, a box of granola in each hand, and looked down the aisle. It was perfectly normal. Same white walls, same beige linoleum floor with the faint geometric pattern worn almost imperceptible from years of cartwheels and foot traffic. Same products aligned in their neat columns, same lighting. I finished stocking the middle shelf, moved to the higher tier, thought nothing more about it. But I kept the observation in the back of my mind the way you do with small oddities, the kind of detail your brain flags as unimportant but files away anyway, just in case. By the time I moved to the produce section, maybe 40 minutes later, I'd already forgotten about the cereal aisle feeling long. I was focused on the work, checking inventory sheets against actual stock, noting what needed filling, what had begun to wilt or brown around the edges. The produce area was my least favorite section. It was the only part of the store that felt organic in its disorder. The rest of Brennan's was geometry and logic. The produce section was chaos. Apples bruised or blemished, avocados at various stages of ripeness, wilting lettuce that should have been pulled 2 days ago but wasn't. I was reorganizing the apple pyramid when I noticed I'd taken a wrong turn. Not dramatically, nothing that would have alarmed anyone else. I'd simply walked to where I thought the back corner was, where the storage bins for excess inventory lived, and found myself 3 feet further back than I expected. The wall was where the middle of the section should have been. I blinked, looked around. The store hadn't changed. It was still the store. Still the same grid of aisles, the same careful organization. But I'd miscalibrated somehow, gotten the distances wrong in my head. I walked back toward the front of the store, reorienting myself. The thing about working somewhere for 5 years is that you develop a kind of proprioceptive map of the space. You know how many steps it takes to get from point A to point B. You know which aisles line up with which. You know the shape of the building so well that you can almost navigate it in the dark. And in fact, you do. Your muscle memory is stronger than your conscious attention. Which is probably why I noticed when my map started to be wrong. I took a step back into the produce section from a different angle. This time, I was trying to be more careful. I was consciously measuring distances, paying attention to the architecture. The produce section should have a particular relationship to the frozen food section beyond it. There should be a hallway between them, narrow, with the restrooms branching off to the left. I walked forward, looking for the hallway. It took me longer than it should have to find it, or maybe shorter. I honestly couldn't say. But when I did, something felt subtly wrong about it. The hallway was too long. I stood at the entrance for a moment, just observing. The hallway was a space I walked through maybe 4 times a shift on any given night. It was maybe 15 feet total, I'd always thought. Narrow, white walls on both sides. That same fluorescent lighting that made everything look equally dead and important. The restroom doors on the left side, the emergency exit on the right, perpendicular to the hallway itself. Very straightforward, very standard. Tonight, looking down it seemed to stretch further back than I remembered. The far wall where the frozen food section began seemed genuinely distant. I walked down it slowly, counting my steps. 14, 15, 16, I reached the end. The frozen food section began just as it should. Everything was normal. Everything was exactly as it had been. I stood there for a moment, my hand resting against the cool aluminum frame of the freezer case. 2:20 in the morning. Nobody else in the store. Just me and the lights and the hum of the refrigeration units. I felt something cross my face that wasn't quite a chill. More like the awareness that something had shifted in my perception, though I couldn't say what. I told myself I was tired. That night shifts did strange things to your sense of space and time. That my internal map of the store was probably less accurate than I thought. That I'd miscounted my steps or forgotten how long the hallway actually was. These were all reasonable explanations. I went back to work. I was in the cereal aisle again, different section this time, restocking the lower shelves. When I became certain that something wasn't right. Not hypothetically, actually certain. The aisle was definitely longer than I remembered. This time I was looking at it head-on, and I could see it clearly. The way the shelf line extended back toward the storeroom. The perspective seemed off. Not dramatically. Not in any way that would have appeared wrong on a photograph or a video recording, but to my eye, present in the space, feeling the dimensions around me, it was perceptibly longer than it had been 2 hours ago. I stood up from the lower shelf and walked backward, looking at the aisle from different angles. Each angle looked slightly different. Each angle suggested the perspective was being drawn out in a way that didn't quite match my memory of it. I should have been more alarmed. Looking back, I don't know why I wasn't. But there's something about small impossibilities that the mind resists taking seriously. It's easier to assume you're wrong than to assume the world is wrong. Easier to believe you've forgotten, misremembered, miscalibrated, than to believe something has actually changed. I went back to restocking, but I was paying attention now. Really paying attention. Over the next hour, I began to notice small things. The relationship between aisles didn't quite feel right. Turning down one aisle to cut across the store, I found myself emerging in a different section than I expected. Not dramatically different, nothing that would have been alarming to a customer, but enough that I'd miscalculated. Enough that the map in my head was failing me in small ways. At one point, I cut diagonally from the dairy section toward the front of the store. I was trying to get to the paper goods aisle. I should have ended up at aisle 3. Instead, I ended up at aisle 4. One aisle over, not a disaster. Easy to correct. But I'd walked a straight line, or at least as straight a line as the grid of the store allowed. By 3:40 a.m., I was actively confused about the layout. I sat down on one of the plastic benches near the front of the store, the kind customers use while waiting, and employees never do, and tried to map the space in my head. I closed my eyes and visualized the store from above, a bird's eye view. The grid of aisles, the stock room in the back, the deli counter on the left, the checkout registers in front, the produce section to the right. It was a simple layout, standardized, the kind of floor plan you'd find in nearly identical supermarkets up and down the highway. I opened my eyes and looked around. The store before me didn't quite match the map in my head. Not dramatically. There was still a deli counter on the left. There were still checkout registers in front. But the distances between things seemed to have shifted. The cereal aisle, which should be near the back, seemed to start further forward than it should. The frozen foods, which should be near the produce section, seemed to have drifted somehow. I stood up and walked to the center of the store. From here, I could see down 5 different aisles at once. The store was a grid, and I was standing roughly in the middle of it. I could look down the sight lines and verify the layout. And the more I looked, the more I realized I couldn't quite verify it. Every aisle looked right individually. But the relationships between them didn't quite make sense. The angles didn't quite close. The distances didn't quite add up. I walked to aisle 3 and walked down it slowly, counting tiles. The floor had a geometric pattern, a kind of interlocking diamond that repeated every 4 tiles. I counted 63 tiles from the front of the store to the back. I walked back to the front and walked down aisle 4. 61 tiles. I should have counted the same number. Roughly, the aisles were all the same depth. That was the whole point of a standardized retail grid. I was very tired, I thought. Night shifts did strange things to your mind. Deprived you of sleep enough hours, and your perception started doing weird things, started miscounting, started seeing patterns that weren't there. But I knew my perception. I'd worked enough night shifts to know the difference between being tired and something actually being wrong. I decided, standing in the middle of the store at 20 to 4 in the morning, that I was going to do something I'd never done before. I was going to actually map the store, physically, with a tape measure and a notebook. I was going to measure every aisle, every distance, every relationship between sections. I was going to prove to myself that nothing had changed. Or I was going to prove that I was going insane, which seemed increasingly likely. I went to the stockroom and found the tape measure. It was old, the numbers rubbed almost illegible in places, but it worked. I grabbed a small notebook and a pencil from the office. I started at the front of the store, measuring the distance from the entrance to the first aisle, then the distance from aisle 1 to aisle 2. I was methodical about it. Careful, I recorded every number in the notebook in my precise, small handwriting. The numbers I found didn't make sense. Not dramatically. Nothing that would have been immediately obvious to a casual observer. But when I did the math, when I added up all the sections and compared them to what I knew the total width of the store to be, there was a discrepancy. I measured again. Same discrepancy. Different numbers, but the same impossible total. I was standing in aisle 7, the tape measure stretched across the linoleum. When I realized something else, I'd been measuring the same aisle 3 times and getting different results each time. Not wildly different, maybe 6 inches of variance across measurements, but it shouldn't have varied at all. A tape measure was a tape measure. An aisle was an aisle. I stood there, the tape measure slack in my hands, and felt something unsettled move through me. It was the feeling you get when you realize you're watching something you don't understand, and it's too late to look away. I looked down the length of aisle 7. It was perfectly ordinary, perfectly normal. Cereal boxes stacked neatly on shelves, fluorescent light casting everything in that sickly white glow, the perfect grid of the retail world around me. But something about it looked longer than it had looked 3 hours ago. I was aware in that moment of something I'd read once. Some psychological principle about how observation changes the observed, how the act of looking at something, measuring it, focusing on it, somehow altered it in subtle ways. I didn't remember where I'd read it, or if that was even accurate, but I thought about it standing there in the fluorescent light, the tape measure in my hands, the impossible numbers in my notebook. What if it wasn't the store that was changing? What if it was me? What if I was the variable, and the store was responding to me in ways I couldn't consciously perceive? I pushed that thought away. It was too close to the kind of thinking that happened late at night, alone, after too many hours without sleep. The kind of thinking that led nowhere good. I went back to stocking. I put the tape measure away. I put the notebook away. I tried to work as if nothing was wrong. But from that point forward, every time I looked at a section of the store, I was aware of it. Aware of it in the way you become aware of something once you've focused on it. You can't unfocus. You can't unsee. The cereal aisle still looked longer than it should. The produce section still felt like it had drifted. The hallway to the restroom still stretched back further than I remembered. And every time I looked away and then looked back, the spaces seemed slightly different. By 5 a.m., an hour before I was supposed to leave, I was exhausted in a way that went beyond fatigue. I'd stopped trying to understand what was happening and had simply accepted it. Something was wrong with either the store or my perception of it. Possibly both. Possibly something more complicated than either option. The lights continued to hum. The products remained perfectly arranged. Everything was exactly as it should be. Except it wasn't. And I was alone in the store with that knowledge, and there was no one I could ask about it who wouldn't think I was describing symptoms of something that required intervention. At 5:45 a.m., I finished the last section. I clocked out. I walked to the exit. And I didn't look at the distances between the aisles as I left, because I was afraid of what I might measure, or what I might see, or what the store might be becoming in the moments when I wasn't quite paying attention. I didn't go back for 3 days. I told myself I needed the break. The overnight shifts had been wearing on me. My sleep was poor, fragmented, shallow, but that was normal. That was what happened when you worked nights. Everyone knew that. But the truth was simpler. I was afraid of what I'd see if I returned. By the 3rd day, the fear had crystallized into something else, a kind of compulsion. I found myself wondering about the store in the daylight hours, between sleep and waking. I thought about the cereal aisle and the produce section. I wondered if the spaces had remained enlarged, or if they'd contracted back to their proper dimensions. I wondered if anything had changed, or if I'd simply misunderstood what I was seeing all along. The rational part of me, the part that had a degree in accounting and paid bills on time and didn't believe in things that couldn't be measured, suggested that I had simply been tired, that the late hour and the fluorescent light and the isolation had played tricks on my perception. It happened. People's brains did that. There was nothing supernatural about it. There was nothing wrong with the store. But there was something wrong with me for even considering it in the first place. I went back on a Friday night. The same shift. The same store. The same fluorescent lights humming their unchanging frequency. Marcus, the manager, barely looked at me when I clocked in. He was younger than me by several years, always wore his polo shirt slightly too tight, and had the kind of confidence that comes from never having seriously questioned anything. "Where have you been?" he asked, not looking up from the schedule. "Sick," I said. "Called in." He nodded and made a notation. That was all. No one cared about absences at a grocery store. There was always someone desperate enough for the work. The store was exactly as I remembered it. The tile floor gleamed. The products were arranged in orderly rows. The produce section smelled like green things and slightly rot, the way produce sections always did. Everything was familiar and normal and completely ordinary. I began stocking shelves. For the first 2 hours, nothing seemed different. I moved through my assigned sections, mostly dry goods and some frozen items, with a kind of deliberate normalcy. I wasn't measuring anything. I wasn't pulling out my notebook. I was simply working, the way I was supposed to work, the way anyone stocking shelves at 1 a.m. should work. But around 3 a.m., I noticed something small. In the pasta section, there was a gap between two shelving units that I didn't remember. It was narrow, maybe 6 inches wide, and it ran vertically up the entire height of the shelves. The gap itself wasn't unusual. Gaps between units were normal. But this one was positioned differently than I remembered. Or maybe it had always been there, and I simply hadn't paid attention before. I stared at it for longer than was reasonable. A box of pens slipped from my hands. It hit the floor and broke open, scattering pasta across the tile in a fan pattern. The noise was loud in the quiet store. I waited for Marcus to appear, to see if I'd done something wrong. No one came. I cleaned up the mess and moved on. An hour later, near the canned goods section, I found myself standing in front of a shelf I'd stocked dozens of times. It was beans, mostly black beans, pinto beans, kidney beans, arranged by size and brand. I was reaching for a space that should have been empty, ready to fill it with a can of chickpeas from my cart. The space was already full. Someone else had stocked it while I wasn't looking. I checked the can. It was in the wrong place. Chickpeas belonged 2 shelves down and to the left. I took the can and moved it to where it should be. The empty space remained, waiting for what should have gone there. I continued working. At 4:15 a.m. I walked past the bathrooms. I hadn't used them since I'd come back. I'd been avoiding that hallway, actually, the one that went back further than seemed right. But I needed water. My mouth was dry. My throat felt tight. I walked toward the break room, which was on the same corridor. The hallway looked normal. The restroom doors were there. The supply closet was there. The emergency exit was there. Everything was exactly where it should be. But the hallway seemed shorter than I remembered. Not by much. Not by an amount I could measure or point to definitively. Just shorter, as if someone had moved the far wall forward or the near wall back by a distance of a few feet. I stood very still in the middle of the hallway. I looked at the distance to the emergency exit at the far end. I tried to estimate how many steps it would take to reach it. 12, maybe 14. I walked it out slowly, counting under my breath. 9 steps. I reached the door and stood in front of it. Above it, the red exit sign cast a dim glow. The door looked like all emergency exits looked, painted gray, fitted with a push bar, fitted with a small camera in the upper corner that recorded the overnight stock crew for insurance purposes. I pushed the bar. The door opened. The alarm didn't sound. It was disabled as always during stock. Outside was the back parking lot. My car was there. The night was cool and dark. The sky the specific blue-black of 4 a.m. I stood in the doorway for a moment. Then I went back inside. The hallway was exactly the same length as it had been when I walked toward the exit. 9 steps. Which meant either I had miscounted the first time, entirely possible, given my state of mind, or the hallway had changed in the few seconds I'd turned my back on it. I didn't measure it. I didn't pull out my notebook. I didn't even acknowledge to myself that I was afraid. I simply returned to the sales floor and continued stocking. The rest of the night was uneventful. I worked steadily. I saw no one except Marcus briefly when he passed through to check something in the stockroom. He didn't speak to me. I didn't speak to him. At 6 a.m., when my shift ended, I clocked out and walked to the exit. I took the most direct route. I didn't look at the aisles. I didn't measure anything. I didn't turn around to look back at the floor space behind me. I simply left. In the parking lot, sitting in my car, I realized I was shaking. It wasn't cold. It was something else. I sat there for 10 minutes, hands gripping the steering wheel, not starting the car. And then I thought about what would happen if I didn't come back. If I quit. If I called Marcus tomorrow and said I couldn't work nights anymore. If I found a different job during daylight hours in a place where the spaces between things remained constant and predictable. The relief I felt at the thought of that was almost overwhelming. But underneath the relief was something else, a kind of stubborn curiosity, a need to know. What if I went back again? What if I paid closer attention next time? What if I measured everything systematically and documented every discrepancy? What if I tried to understand what was happening? I started the car. I drove home. The sun was just beginning to lighten the sky at the eastern horizon, turning it pale gray, then pale blue. Everything looked normal in daylight. The world made sense again. But I knew I would go back. I knew I had to. Because the alternative, living the rest of my life wondering what was changing, what was wrong, whether I could trust my own perception of spaces and distances, was somehow worse than the fear itself. The next time I worked, I brought equipment, not just the tape measure, a notebook with grid paper, a compass, my phone loaded with a floor plan app. I told myself it was about gathering data, about approaching this rationally, about either confirming that something was genuinely wrong with the store or confirming that I was the problem. I told myself it was science, not obsession. The night I returned, Marcus gave me a strange look when I clocked in. "You feeling okay?" he asked. "You look like you haven't slept." "I'm fine," I said. "Long day yesterday." He nodded and didn't ask further. People in grocery stores didn't press for personal details. That was part of the agreement. You showed up, you did your work. You didn't burden anyone with your internal state. I moved through the store that night with a kind of methodical precision. I measured the cereal aisle, noted the measurement, moved to produce, measured it, noted the dimensions. The produce section was definitely larger than it should have been, based on the external dimensions of the building as I understood them. The difference was subtle, a few feet at most, but it was there. Someone came around the corner while I was crouched in the produce section, measuring the space between the apple display and the wall. It was a customer, a woman, older, gray-haired, with a tired face. She looked at me looking at her. She looked at the tape measure in my hands. "Excuse me," I said automatically, moving aside. She moved past me without speaking. She selected an apple from the display. She moved on. I watched her go. And I thought, she didn't see anything unusual about me measuring the space. Or if she did, she didn't care. To her, I was just an employee, perhaps a bit odd, but not remarkable. not threatening. Not someone whose fundamental relationship with reality was beginning to fracture. By 4 a.m. that night, I had measurements for 9 different sections of the store. 8 of them were consistent with the building's external dimensions and layout. One of them, a section of the health and beauty aisle tucked near the pharmacy counter, was approximately 4 feet larger than it should have been, based on where the exterior wall actually was. 4 feet. That was a discrepancy I couldn't rationalize away. That wasn't eye strain or fatigue or trick light. That was a measurable, reproducible difference between what should be and what actually was. I stood in front of the health and beauty section at 4:30 a.m., tape measure in hand, notebook open, and I felt something shift in my mind. Not click into place. The opposite of that. Shift. The way a perspective drawing shifts when you stare at it long enough, and suddenly the foreground becomes background and the background becomes foreground, and you can never quite see it the original way again. The store was wrong. Or I was wrong. Or the distinction between those two things had become meaningless. I put away my equipment. I finished my shift. I left the same way I always left, without looking back, without measuring, without acknowledging what I now knew for certain something was impossible. And I was living inside it, and no one else seemed to have noticed. The next morning, I called in sick again, and I began to think about what that meant. What it meant that a space could be larger than it should be. What it meant that dimensions could be inconsistent. What it meant to work in a place where the rules of architecture and geometry seemed to operate differently than they should. What it meant that I was beginning to suspect the change had nothing to do with the store at all. I didn't go back for 3 days. On the first day, I told myself I was sick. My body agreed with the lie. My stomach was tight. My sleep was fragmented. My hands moved with an uncertainty that felt borrowed from someone else's nervous system. On the second day, I told myself I needed time to think. On the third day, I stopped telling myself anything and just existed in my apartment, moving between the kitchen and the bedroom and the living room in patterns that felt increasingly strange, as if the rooms themselves were subtly rearranging when I wasn't looking. They weren't. I checked multiple times. By the evening of the third day, the store had called. Not Blake, my manager. I realized I'd never actually spoken to Blake directly, though I'd worked there for 8 months. Someone else. A voice I didn't recognize, professional and neutral, asking when I'd be returning. I gave them a date 4 days away. They accepted it without comment. I hung up the phone and thought about the fact that they hadn't asked what was wrong with me. They hadn't asked if I needed anything. They'd simply confirmed that I would return, as if the matter were settled, as if my absence and return were already known variables in some equation that didn't require my input. That was when I decided to measure my apartment. It was a small place, a 1-bedroom in a building that was constructed sometime in the 1970s. The kind of structure where pipes were visible in the bathroom and the kitchen cabinet doors didn't quite close flush. I knew the dimensions. I'd stood in the leasing office when I signed the paperwork. 950 square feet. The woman had shown me the blueprint. I started in the bedroom. The process took longer than I expected. The bedroom was simple enough. Walls that lined up correctly. A closet that was the right size. Windows that reflected the street below with appropriate perspective. But when I measured from one wall to the opposite wall, and then measured the hallway and the living room, and then came back and added it all up, the numbers didn't align with the blueprint in my head. They were smaller. The entire apartment was about 30 square feet smaller than it should have been. 30 square feet. A space roughly 6 by 5. It was gone. I sat on the kitchen floor at 11 p.m. and felt the shift happen again, that fundamental reorientation of perspective that made it impossible to see the world the way I'd seen it before. The apartment was wrong, or I was wrong, or something had taken the distinction between those two states and dissolved it. I stood up. I walked the perimeter again, more slowly this time, less carefully. I wasn't trying to verify the measurements anymore. I was trying to find where the missing space had gone. I moved through the hallway and into the living room and looked at the walls and the corners and the places where the wall met the floor, and everything looked normal. Everything looked exactly as it always had. But it was smaller. I knew it was smaller. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat in the dark living room and thought about the grocery store. I thought about the health and beauty aisle. I thought about the 4 feet of space that existed where it shouldn't exist. I thought about whether that space was still there, expanding slowly in my absence, growing like something that needed room to breathe. I thought about whether it had moved, whether it was moving. I thought about the woman with the gray hair selecting her apple, and whether she'd been real or whether she'd been something else, a placeholder, a test, something designed to see whether I would react if confronted with normalcy in the presence of wrongness. When morning came, I called the store back, not to confirm my return, but to ask a question I didn't yet know how to phrase. Blake answered. Blake, who I'd never spoken to directly, whose voice I didn't recognize and yet somehow did. I need to ask you something about the building, I said. Of course, Blake said. There was no surprise in his voice, no sense that this was an unusual request. The dimensions, the layout. Has anything been changed? Any renovations? Any modifications to the space? There was a silence on the other end of the line. Why are you asking? Blake said. Because something is wrong with it. No, Blake said. Nothing's been changed. The story's exactly as it's always been. That's not true, I said. I heard my own voice becoming something I didn't recognize. Higher, tighter, the voice of someone standing on ground that was beginning to shift beneath them. There's a section of the health and beauty aisle that's larger than it should be. The produce section, the cereal aisle. The dimensions don't match the external walls. Another silence. When are you coming back? Blake asked. I don't know if I'm coming back. Yes, Blake said. You are. The certainty in his voice, not commanding, not threatening, just absolutely assured, made something in my chest tighten. It was the certainty of someone stating a fact so obvious that it required no debate. "How do you know that?" I asked. "Because you have to," Blake said. "Everyone has to. Eventually, once you've noticed, you have to keep looking. You have to figure it out." "Figure what out?" But Blake had hung up. I held the phone for a long time after that. I stood in my apartment, which was 30 square feet too small, which was wrong in a way that couldn't be fixed or explained, and I understood something with a clarity that felt almost like falling. Blake was waiting. The store was waiting. And I had set something in motion the moment I picked up that tape measure. I couldn't unsee what I'd seen. I couldn't unhear what I'd heard. I couldn't unknow what I now knew, that the world contained spaces that didn't follow the rules I'd always believed in, and once you became aware of those spaces, they became aware of you. On the morning of my return, I dressed in my uniform and drove to the store. The parking lot was the same. The building looked the same. The sliding doors opened the same way. But as I walked through them, I felt it, a kind of pressure, a settled distortion in the air itself, like walking into a room where the temperature is slightly off and you can't figure out why. The store was different now, not in any way I could point to directly. But it was watching. It was waiting. It was aware that I'd come back. And somewhere in the depths of it, in a section that shouldn't exist, in a space that had no right to be, something had expanded while I was gone. And it was still expanding, and I would have to find it eventually. Because Blake was right. Once you've noticed, you have to keep looking. Hashtag the grocery store layout that changes when I'm not looking. Part 4, the first week back, felt like walking through water. My body was present, scanning items, bagging groceries, moving through the fluorescent lit aisles with the practiced muscle memory of someone who'd done this hundreds of times. But something essential had been displaced. I existed in the store, but I wasn't entirely there. Part of me remained in my apartment, standing in the dark, holding that phone, listening to Blake's voice confirm what I'd already begun to suspect. The other employees didn't seem to notice anything different about me, though I kept waiting for them to. I kept expecting someone to look at me and see what I now knew, that I'd crossed some invisible threshold, that I'd glimpsed something that most people never did. But they moved through their shifts with the same disconnected routine they always had. Morgan restocked the dairy section. Taylor worked the registers. Casey made comments about the weather that no one responded to. They seemed almost unreal to me now, like extras moving through a scene they didn't understand. Blake worked the closing shift with me on my third day back. He didn't speak to me directly until near the end of the night, when we were both alone in the stockroom. I was breaking down boxes, folding them flat, stacking them in the bin, and I heard him approach before I saw him. "You've been measuring again," Blake said. It wasn't a question. I didn't look up from the box I was holding. "How did you know?" "Because I did too, when I first noticed." The box in my hand suddenly felt very heavy. I set it down. "How long have you known?" I asked. Blake was quiet for a moment. He was older than me, mid-40s maybe, with graying hair that he kept in a neat, careful style. In the harsh light of the stockroom, I could see something in his face that I recognized now. The same thing I probably saw in my own mirror these days. The look of someone who couldn't quite believe what they'd learned and couldn't forget it. 3 years, Blake said. I was the produce manager then. I noticed that the department was taking up more space than it should have been. Small things at first. A shelf that was wider than the one behind it. A corridor that was longer in one direction than it was coming back. But the more I looked, the more the inconsistencies compounded. It became like staring at one of those optical illusions. Once you see it, you can't see anything else. What did you do? I asked. What you're doing? I measured. I made notes. I tried to create a map of the space that made sense. And then one day I realized I couldn't do it. There was no map that worked. The building contains more space internally than it should contain. It's not a settled thing. It's just obscured somehow by what I don't know. By something I don't have a framework for understanding. I wanted to ask him what he'd done after that, how he'd lived with it, how he'd continued to show up to work and pretend that everything was normal. But I thought I already knew the answer. The dimensions of my apartment are wrong too, I said. Blake nodded slowly. That happens. It spreads. Not in the store. I haven't measured anything new there in almost 2 years. I stopped looking. But personal spaces, yes. That tends to continue for a while. It settles eventually. You just learn to live with the wrongness. You get used to it being there. What if I don't want to get used to it? Blake looked at me directly then, and there was something sad in his expression. Not pity exactly, but recognition of a pain he'd already lived through. Then you leave, he said. Some people do. They quit. They move away. They try to return to a place where the rules make sense. Does it work? I don't know, Blake said. They never come back to tell me. But they always leave looking the same way you probably look right now. Like they're hoping that if they run far enough, they can outpace the knowledge. Like maybe if they stop measuring, stop looking, stop acknowledging what they've seen, it will fade away, and they can return to the way things were. And you didn't leave, I said. No, why not? Blake was quiet. He looked away from me, toward the pallets stacked against the far wall, the endless identical boxes waiting to be unpacked and placed on shelves that didn't add up. Because I wanted to understand, he said finally, and because I thought that if I kept working here, kept watching, kept paying attention, I might figure out why this is happening. I still think that. Every shift, I think maybe today is the day I'll see something that makes sense of it all. Maybe today I'll understand the logic underneath. Have you? No. We finished the closing tasks in silence after that. I mopped the floors while Blake counted the registers. We locked the doors and walked out to the parking lot together. The night was clear and cool, the kind of night that should feel normal, should feel like nothing was wrong. But I'd developed a sensitivity to the wrongness now. I could feel it even in the parking lot, a settled distortion, like looking at the world through water. The streetlights didn't quite illuminate the pavement the way they should. The distance from the store to my car seemed slightly farther than I remembered. It helps if you stop trying to map it, Blake said as we reached our cars. Stop trying to make it logical. Just accept that it's there, that it doesn't follow the rules you're used to, and move forward anyway. The stress comes from the resistance, not from the space itself. I drove home that night with his words cycling through my mind. Accept the wrongness. Stop resisting. Just live with it. But acceptance felt like surrender. It felt like allowing something into my life that shouldn't be there, admitting that my understanding of how the world worked was fundamentally flawed. The thing was, I couldn't unfasten this knowledge from myself. I tried, just never noticed. What if Blake and I and any others who'd become aware of the wrongness weren't discovering something that had changed, but rather discovering something that had always been underneath, waiting for us to pay attention? I didn't pursue that thought. I went back to bed and lay in the dark, and I made a deliberate effort to think about other things. I focused on work, on the small routines of my day, on the mundane normalcy of existence. I allowed my mind to move away from the wrongness, the way Blake had suggested. And it helped, the way it had helped before. But it didn't erase what I'd learned. It didn't make the knowledge go away. And it certainly didn't change the fact that every time I pass the health and beauty aisle now, I feel it, that subtle pressure in the air, that sense of a space that's slightly larger than it should be, that's still growing, or has always been growing, or exists in some state between growing and static that I don't have language for. It's always there, always just barely perceptible, always waiting for me to stop looking away. I've accepted it, the way Blake suggested. I've incorporated it into my understanding of how the world works. And it's true that the anxiety has diminished considerably. But last week I was in my apartment at night, sitting in my living room with the lights on, and I noticed something small, something I can't quite explain. The wall in front of me, the wall that's 6 inches farther away than it should be, seemed to be the wrong color in one specific spot. Just a small section, maybe 2 inches wide, toward the bottom left corner. Not dramatically wrong, just a shade of white that was slightly different from the rest, slightly more blue, slightly less solid. I stared at it for a long time. I wanted to get up and move closer, to examine it, to understand what I was seeing. But I didn't, because I recognized what was happening. I recognized the pull of the awareness, the way it would escalate if I let it, the way the small wrongness would expand in my mind until it consumed everything, until I was measuring again, investigating again, feeding something that I'd already learned it was better not to feed. So I sat in my living room with the lights on, and I looked at that spot on the wall, and I didn't move. I didn't measure. I didn't investigate. I just sat with it. The wrongness, the knowledge, the small, impossible thing that shouldn't be there, but was. And it stayed with me long after I'd turned off the lights and gone to bed. It's still there now, actually, even as I'm telling you this, even as I'm trying to explain something that exists in the margins of what can be explained. It's there, in the corner of my vision, in the corner of my awareness, a spot of wrong white on an impossible wall. And I'm learning to live with it, the way Blake lives with the expanded aisles, the way I suspect all of us eventually learn to live with the spaces that don't add up.